So when we find ourselves in difficult, perhaps even dire situations, what exactly should we have ready and at the front of our minds? The most crucial thing is the clear understanding of what is actually ours and what is not ours. We need to know what we have the power to do and what we simply cannot do. Think about our inevitable end. We all must die. But does that mean we have to die crying and complaining? No. Suppose you have to be put in chains. Does that mean you also have to moan and groan about it? Absolutely not. Suppose you must be sent into exile. Is there any force in the world that can stop you from walking into that exile with a smile on your face, feeling perfectly calm and completely composed? Imagine someone demanding, "Tell us your deepest secrets." You can calmly reply, "I refuse, because keeping my secrets is something that is entirely up to me." They might threaten you, saying, "I am going to put you in chains." To which you can respond, "What are you talking about, my friend? You can only put chains on my physical leg. Not even God himself can conquer or chain my free will." They might go further and say, "I will throw you into prison." You can correct them by pointing out, "Actually, it is only my physical body that you will throw into a prison cell." If they escalate to the ultimate threat, saying, "I will behead you," you can simply answer, "Well, when did I ever make the claim that my neck was the only one in the world that could not be severed?" This is exactly the kind of strong, resilient attitude you need to actively cultivate if you truly want to be a philosopher. These are the very sentiments you should be writing down every single day, internalizing them, and most importantly, putting them into practice in your real life. Consider the example of Thracia, who used to say that he would rather be killed today than be banished tomorrow. But then look at how Musonius responded to him. Musonius pointed out the flaw in that logic. He asked, "If you are choosing death because you think it is the greater evil, what sense does that possibly make? On the other hand, if you are choosing death because you think it is the lesser evil, you must remember who gave you that choice in the first place. Instead of trying to escape, why not try coming to terms with the circumstances you have actually been given?" Then there is the wonderful example of Agrippinus, who had a habit of saying, "I do not add to my own troubles." To show you what he meant, there was a time when someone came up to him and said, "You are currently being tried in the Senate, good luck." But at that moment, it was 11 o'clock in the morning. And at 11 o'clock, Agrippinus always had his usual routine of taking his bath and doing his exercise. So rather than panicking, he simply said, "Let us be off to exercise." After he had finished his routine, a messenger arrived with the news that he had indeed been condemned by the Senate. Agrippinus calmly asked, "Was I condemned to exile or was I condemned to death?" The messenger replied, "To exile." Agrippinus then asked, "And what about my estate? Has my property been confiscated?" The messenger answered, "No, it has not been confiscated." Hearing this, Agrippinus cheerfully said, "Well then, let us go to my villa in Aricia and enjoy our lunch there." This remarkable story shows us exactly what is possible when we practice what is truly necessary. It shows what happens when we train ourselves to make our desires and our aversions completely safe against any kind of setback or adversity. Agrippinus understood the ultimate truth. He could say, "I have to die. If it is happening right now, well then I will die right now. But if it is going to happen later, then right now I am going to have my lunch because the hour for lunch has arrived. I will take care of the dying part later." How can someone achieve this level of peace? By living as a person who fully understands that eventually you just have to return what actually belongs to someone else. Moving on to another profound topic, let us discuss how a person can preserve their proper character in absolutely any situation. Human beings are fundamentally rational animals. Because of this, we can put up with almost anything, except for what seems to us to be completely irrational. As long as something makes rational sense, we find it tolerable. Physical hardships, for instance, are not inherently intolerable by their very nature. Just look at the Spartans. They would gladly submit to being whipped, enduring terrible pain, simply because they were taught that there was a good, rational reason for it. You might ask, but what about something as extreme as being hanged? Is that not universally intolerable? Well, surprisingly, people frequently choose to go and hang themselves whenever they make the personal judgment that it is a reasonable course of action for their specific circumstances. In short, if you reflect on human behavior, you will see that people are repelled by nothing as much as they are repelled by what they believe is unreasonable. Conversely, people are attracted to nothing more strongly than what seems completely reasonable to them. The catch, however, is that our individual standards of what is reasonable and what is unreasonable vary wildly from one person to the next. It is exactly like how we all have different opinions on what we consider to be good or bad, or what we think is harmful versus what is beneficial. This is exactly why education has no goal more important than this: bringing our own personal preconceptions of what is reasonable and unreasonable into perfect alignment with nature and objective reality. Achieving this alignment does not just involve weighing the external value of things around us. It also means looking inward and deeply considering what agrees with our own individual nature and character. For example, for one person, it might seem perfectly reasonable to work as a bathroom attendant. This person might only be thinking about the severe punishment and extreme poverty that wait for him if he refuses the job. He knows that if he just accepts the humble assignment, he will be spared from a much greater pain and hardship. So, it makes sense to him. However, someone else might look at that exact same situation and not only find such a lowly job utterly intolerable for themselves personally, but they might even find it completely intolerable that any human being should ever have to perform such a task. So if you were to come and ask me, should I take the job as a bathroom attendant or not? My initial answer would be very practical. I would tell you that earning a living and surviving is always better than starving to death. Therefore, if you are measuring your interests solely by the criteria of physical survival and basic needs, you should absolutely go ahead and take the job. However, you might push back and say, but taking such a job would be completely beneath my personal dignity. To that, I would reply that your dignity is an entirely additional factor. That is a condition that you are bringing into the question, not me. You are the only person who truly knows yourself. This means you are the only one who knows how much you are actually worth in your own estimation. Consequently, you are the only one who can decide at what price you are willing to sell your principles or your dignity. And the truth is, different people sell themselves at very different rates. To illustrate this, consider the story of Agrippinus and Florus. Florus was debating whether or not he should attend the Emperor Nero's festival, and he was even considering participating in it. He asked Agrippinus for advice, and Agrippinus simply told him to go ahead and participate. Florus was surprised by this advice and asked Agrippinus why he was not planning to go to the festival himself. Agrippinus gave a profound answer. He said, "I do not even consider going as a possibility." You see, Agrippinus understood that constantly weighing the value of external things, like fame, safety, or imperial favor, always comes at a significant cost to the internal value of your own character. So, if you want to know a general rule about whether life or death is better, the answer I will give you is that life is better. If you ask me about pain versus pleasure, I will always say that pleasure is preferable. But then you might say, if I refuse to participate in Nero's festival, the emperor will kill me. If that is your primary concern, my advice to you is to go ahead and participate. But as for me, I will still absolutely refuse. You might ask why I would refuse. It is because you view yourself as just a single, ordinary thread in a massive robe. You believe your duty is simply to blend in and conform to the massive crowd of people, just as a single white thread in a white garment has no desire to clash with the rest of the fabric. But I view myself differently. I aspire to be the brilliant purple stripe on the hem of that garment. Even though the purple stripe is just a tiny part of the whole, it is the exact part that makes the entire garment look beautiful and distinguished. So please do not tell me to just be like all the rest of the people. If I become like everyone else, I can no longer be that purple stripe. The great Helvidius Priscus perfectly demonstrated this exact principle through his own actions. There was a time when Emperor Vespasian sent a message explicitly barring him from attending the Senate. Helvidius Priscus responded by saying, "You have the power to disqualify me from being a senator, but as long as I remain a member of the Senate, I must go and join the assembly." The emperor replied, "Well, you can join the assembly, but do not say anything." Priscus shot back, "If you do not call on me for my vote, then I will not say anything." The emperor insisted, "But as the emperor, I must call on you for your vote." To which Priscus responded, "And when you call on me, I have to give whatever answer I believe is right and just." The emperor then threatened him, saying, "If you answer, I will kill you." Priscus remained completely unfazed. He asked, "Did I ever tell you that I was immortal? You do your part and I will do my part. It is your part to kill me, but it is my part to die without flinching. It is your part to send me into exile, but it is my part to pack my bags and leave without a single word of protest." You might wonder, what did Priscus actually accomplish by acting this way? After all, he was only one single man going up against an emperor. But ask yourself, what good does the purple stripe do for the rest of the robe? The answer is that its sheer brilliance and unique luster serve as a magnificent example to all the other threads. Think about what would have happened if it had been someone else, someone ordinary in that exact same situation. If the emperor had barred an ordinary politician from entering the Senate, that person probably would have bowed and said, "Oh, I am so deeply grateful that you can spare me from this duty." In reality, the emperor would never have even bothered to bar an ordinary man like that in the first place. The emperor would have known perfectly well that such a man would either sit in the Senate like a mindless blockhead, or if he did open his mouth to speak, he would only spout the exact words he knew Caesar wanted to hear, and he would probably pile on additional empty flatteries on top of it. We can see a comparable choice in the tragic story of a certain athlete. This athlete developed a condition where he was at risk of dying unless his genitals were amputated. His brother, who happened to be a philosopher, went to him and asked, "Well, my brother, what is your decision going to be? Are you going to have the amputation done so that you can return to your life of training in the gymnasium?" The athlete, however, absolutely refused to submit to such a massive personal indignity. Instead, he summoned the inner strength and the will to accept death. When people heard about this, someone asked Epictetus, Did this man choose death because he was an athlete or because he was a philosopher? Epictetus answered that he chose death simply as a man, but not just any man. He was a man who had competed at the absolute highest level of the Olympic Games. He was a highly familiar, respected figure there, and he had been a champion victor more than once. He was not just some occasional, casual visitor to a local gym. He had a specific identity and standard for his own body and life. Epictetus added that someone else, with a lower estimation of their own dignity, might have even allowed their own head to be removed if they somehow believed their mere biological life could be saved by doing so. This entire mindset is exactly what I mean when I talk about having deep consideration for one's own character. The story of the athlete shows just how weighty and powerful a factor character can be, provided it is actually allowed to play a regular role in a person's daily deliberations and choices. For example, imagine someone coming to me and demanding, "Come on, Epictetus, shave off your philosopher's beard." My response would be clear. If I am truly a philosopher, I will not shave it off because it represents my identity and my commitments. They might escalate and threaten, but if you refuse, I will cut off your head. To which I would simply reply, if cutting off my head will actually do you any good, then go ahead and cut it off. Hearing this kind of extreme example, someone naturally asked, but how do we actually know what is in keeping with our own personal character? To answer that, think about the animal kingdom. How does a bull realize its own immense strength? How does it know to rush out and protect the entire herd the moment a lion attacks? The truth is, the possession of a particular talent or a profound inner strength is instinctively sensed by the one who possesses it. Therefore, if any of you are blessed with that level of exceptional strength and character, you will undoubtedly be the first person to know it. It is absolutely true, however, that no bull reaches full maturity in a single instant. In the same way, ordinary men do not transform into great heroes overnight. We all must endure a harsh winter training. We cannot be foolishly dashing into extreme situations for which we are not yet mentally or physically prepared. You must constantly consider the price at which you are willing to sell your integrity. But please, for the love of God, do not sell it cheap. Making the grand gesture or offering the ultimate sacrifice might not be your role. That level of action perhaps belongs to others, to people who operate on the elite level of someone like Socrates. You might ask, but if human beings are endowed by nature with the potential for this kind of greatness, why do only a select few of us actually achieve it? Well, look at the world around us. Do all horses eventually become magnificent stallions? Are all dogs bred to be lightning-fast greyhounds? Of course not. But here is the crucial point. Even if I know that I lack the supreme talent of a genius, I will absolutely not abandon my effort just because of that. Epictetus will probably never be better than Socrates, but if I can manage to be no worse than my current self, and if I can make steady progress, then I am completely satisfied. Let me give you some other examples. I know that I will never be Milo, the famous Olympic wrestler. Nevertheless, I do not just neglect my physical body. Furthermore, I know I will never be another Croesus, the fabulously wealthy king. And still, I do not neglect taking care of my own modest property and finances. In short, we should never abandon any valuable discipline or pursuit simply out of a sense of despair that we will never be the absolute best at it. Now, let us explore Chapter 3. Which deals with how we should draw the correct consequences from the fact that God is the Father of all mankind. If we could completely and truly subscribe, exactly as we should, to the philosophical view that we are all primary creatures of God, and that God is the Father of both the gods and all men, I honestly do not believe that we would ever entertain mean, petty, or lowly thoughts about ourselves again. Think about human society. If the human emperor suddenly adopts you into his family, you would become so arrogant that no one would be able to put up with your pretension. But if you deeply know and understand that you are actually a child of God, shouldn't your sense of pride and dignity be that much greater? In actual fact, however, we tend to react quite differently to our nature. Two distinct elements are combined in our creation. First, there is the physical body, which is a trait we share in common with the beasts of the field. Second, there is reason and good judgment, which is the divine spark we share with the gods. Unfortunately, the vast majority of us tend to lean heavily toward that first connection, the body, even though it is miserable and completely mortal. Meanwhile, only a rare few choose to favor our holy and blessed alliance with the divine reason. Since every single person will necessarily treat things in strict accordance with their underlying beliefs about those things, those rare few people who believe they are born for fidelity, respect, and confidence in how they use their mental impressions, never entertain any mean or ignoble thoughts about themselves. However, the vast majority of people do the exact opposite. The majority walks around saying things like, "What am I really? Just a wretched mortal, nothing but a feeble piece of flesh." To that I say, you are feeble indeed when it comes to the flesh, but you possess something infinitely better than just flesh. So why in the world would you turn away from that divine spark and choose to cling to the fragile, mortal part of yourself? Because of this unhealthy obsession with our animal connection, some of us sink down to the level of wolves. We become faithless, vicious, and completely treacherous. Others among us turn into lions. We become wild, savage, and totally uncivilized. But perhaps worst of all, most of us simply become like foxes, which is the sorriest fate of the entire lot. After all, what else is a spiteful, malicious, and sneaky person except a fox? Or perhaps they are something even lower and fundamentally less dignified than a fox. You must see to it that you do not let yourself turn out like one of those unfortunate, degraded creatures. Moving on to Chapter 4, which discusses the vital topic of making actual progress. Consider a person who is truly making progress. This is someone who has learned from the philosophers that human desire is properly directed only toward truly good things, and that avoidance is properly directed only toward truly bad things. This person has also learned the critical lesson that true impassivity, peace of mind, and a smooth, good flow of life simply cannot be attained except through unerring desire and completely unfailing avoidance. Once a person understands this, they will do one of two things. They will either do away with their desire altogether, or at the very least, they will defer that desire to another time. And most importantly, they will exercise their avoidance exclusively on things that fall entirely within the moral sphere, meaning things that are completely under their own control. They do this because they know that if they try to avoid anything that falls outside the moral sphere, things like illness, poverty, or bad reputation, they are inevitably going to run into something that goes against their aversion. When that happens, they will face disaster and misery. But think about what virtue actually promises. If virtue truly holds the promise to secure human happiness, to create impassivity and inner peace, and to ensure a good, smooth flow of life, then any real progress toward virtue must necessarily involve progress toward these other states as well. This is simply a law of nature. Wherever the ultimate perfection of anything tends to lead, any progress made is always just a steady approach toward that exact same thing. So this raises a very important question. How is it that, even though we have now all agreed about the true nature of virtue, we still constantly try to demonstrate our progress in areas that are completely unrelated to it? Ask yourself, what is the ultimate goal of virtue, after all, except to create a life that flows smoothly and peacefully? If that is true, then who is actually making progress? Is it simply the person who has read a large number of books by Chrysippus? Is the sum total of virtue really nothing more than this, to just become highly literate in the writings of Chrysippus? Because, if that is all virtue is, then logical progress could not amount to anything more than just memorizing and learning as much of Chrysippus as we possibly can. We have already agreed, however, that virtue produces one specific thing, which is a smooth and happy life. But somehow, we are maintaining the contradictory idea that the approach to virtue, our so-called progress, results in something entirely different, like just reading more books. Imagine someone saying sarcastically, "Wow, this person can already read Chrysippus all by himself. By God, you are really making progress. Some progress, that is." Another person might ask, "Why do you make fun of him?" And the answer is, well, why do you try to distract him from coming to a true awareness of his own faults? Do you not want to show him the actual purpose of virtue, so that he will finally know what real, genuine progress consists of? If you want to find real progress, look for it in your own volition, my friend. Look for it in your own desires and your own avoidances. You should make it your ultimate goal never to fail in getting what you truly desire, and never to experience the things you would rather avoid. You must try never to make an error in your impulses or your repulsions. You should also aim to be absolutely perfect in the practice of paying attention, and in knowing when to withhold your judgment. But out of all these things, the very first subjects, our desires and aversions, are by far the most essential. If you claim that you are aiming to be perfect, but you are still constantly anxious and apprehensive about the world, how can you possibly say that you have made any real progress? So let us see some actual evidence of this progress. But instead of showing real evidence, people act like a confused athlete. It is as if I were to go up to an athlete and say, "Show me your shoulders so I can see how strong you are." And instead of flexing, the athlete responds with, "Have a look at my heavy weights." I would tell him, "Get out of here with you and your gigantic weights." What I want to see is not the metal weights themselves, but how your body has actually profited from lifting them. In the same way, a student might say to me, "Take this treatise on impulse and see how incredibly well I have read it." To which I would reply, "You idiot. That is not what I am after at all. I want to know exactly how you put impulse and repulsion into actual practice in your daily life. I want to know how you handle desire and avoidance. I want to know how you apply yourself, how you prepare for challenges, and how you practice focused attention. I want to see all of this so that I can decide whether, in your specific case, these functions are actually operating in harmony with nature. If you are, in fact, acting in perfect accord with nature, then show me that in your actions, and I will be the very first person to stand up and say that you are truly making progress. But if you cannot show me that, then just be off with you. Rather than just sitting around writing comments on other people's books, you might as well just go and write one yourself. But in the end, what good will that actually do for you? You know as well as I do that a whole book costs around 5 denarii. Is the person who just comments on that book really worth any more than those 5 denarii? The lesson here is simple. Do not put your true purpose in one place, like your own character, and then expect to see progress made somewhere completely else, like in how many books you have read. So that brings us back to the ultimate question: where is progress then? If you want to know what real progress looks like, look for the person who actively renounces all external things. Look for the person who instead pays close attention to their own character. This person spends their time cultivating and perfecting that character so that it completely agrees with nature. They work hard to make their character honest and trustworthy. They make it elevated, completely free, unchecked by outside forces, and undeterred by any obstacles. This person is making progress if they have learned a vital lesson. They have learned that anyone who desires or tries to avoid things that are totally outside of their control can never truly be free, nor can they be faithful to themselves. Instead, that kind of person is forced to constantly shift and fluctuate right along with the unpredictable winds of fortune. They become a slave, completely subject to anyone who happens to have the power to either give them or take away those external things they crave. Furthermore, look to see if this person adheres to their highest ideals from the very moment they get up in the morning. Notice if they eat their meals and take their baths like a true person of integrity. Observe if they are actually putting their philosophical principles into concrete practice in every single situation they face throughout the day. They should be doing this just like a dedicated runner applies the strict principles of running when they train, or just as a professional singer applies the principles of musicianship. When you see a person doing all of this, that is exactly where you will see true progress perfectly embodied. That is when you will finally find someone who has not simply wasted their time by making the long journey away from their home to study philosophy. On the other hand, consider someone whose one and only passion is just reading books. This is a person who does very little else besides reading, and they actually moved away from home specifically just to do this. My honest advice for that person is to turn around, go back home immediately, and just attend to their normal business affairs there. I say this because, philosophically speaking, they left their home for absolutely nothing. A true student of philosophy should instead be practicing how to completely expunge negative emotions from his life. He should be working on eliminating sighs and sorrow, getting rid of grief and disappointment, and stopping exclamations like, "Oh, poor me," or "Alas, what a tragedy." A student should genuinely learn what death actually is. He should learn to understand the reality of exile, the reality of going to jail, and even the reality of facing execution by drinking hemlock. The goal is that at the end of the day, when faced with the worst, he can calmly say exactly what Socrates said while sitting in prison. Socrates said, "Dear Crito, if it pleases the gods, then so be it." That is the correct response, instead of crying out and saying, "Oh, poor me, I am just a frail old man. Is this terrible fate what old age held in store for me?" And please do not imagine that I am only referring to humble or obscure people who make these kinds of complaints. Even King Priam says things like this. So does Oedipus. In fact, if you look closely, you will find almost all the great kings of ancient legend saying these exact same pitiful things. Think about it. What else are all those famous theatrical tragedies, if not just the stories of the terrible ordeals of people who made the mistake of valuing external things? They are just ordinary human failures, completely tricked out in fancy tragic verse. To be completely honest, If I had to be tricked or deceived into believing that external things which lie outside of our power are not a man's proper concern, I would personally consent to that deception. I would accept the trick, provided that the deception could actually enable me to live an entirely untroubled life, full of true peace of mind. As for which condition you personally prefer, the life of anxiety or the life of peace, that is something you will have to determine for yourself. Now, consider what the great philosopher Chrysippus actually gives us. He says that in order to make absolutely certain that these philosophical doctrines, which promise freedom from passion and true serenity, are legitimate, you should take all of his books and study them. If you do, he promises that you will find that the specific knowledge that makes him impassive and peaceful is completely faithful to, and perfectly in accord with, nature itself. How incredibly lucky we are! A massive benefactor, and truly, how great a benefactor he is, has clearly shown us the proper way to live. Throughout history, men have erected grand altars to mythical figures like Triptolemus simply for giving humanity the art of farming and agriculture. But think about the man who actually found, disclosed, and carefully explained the ultimate truth to everyone. And I do not mean just the truth that pertains to merely staying alive, but the profound truth of how to live a good life. Which one of you has ever raised an altar to that man? Who has ever built a temple, erected a beautiful statue, or venerated God in gratitude for the gift of philosophy? We eagerly offer the gods sacrifices just because they gave us physical things like wheat and wine. But those same gods have produced something so much greater. They have produced such wonderful, intellectual fruit inside the human mind. This was all part of their grand plan to bestow upon humanity the true, ultimate secret of happiness. Knowing this, are we really going to completely forget to express our deepest gratitude to them on that account? Moving on to Chapter 5, which is an argument directed against the skeptics. If a man stubbornly objects to truths that are all too evident and obvious to everyone else, it is certainly no easy task finding any logical arguments that will actually change his mind. However, his stubbornness is not a proof of his own intellectual strength, nor does it prove the weakness of his teacher's arguments. The reality is that when someone gets caught up in an argument and deliberately hardens themselves to stone, there is simply no more reasoning with them at all. Now, a person can suffer from two very distinct kinds of petrifaction, or turning to stone. The first is a petrifaction of the intellect, where the mind simply freezes. The second is a petrifaction of the person's sense of honor. This happens when somebody assumes a completely defiant stance and becomes resolved that they will never assent to self-evident truths, but they also refuse to just leave off fighting and arguing. It is a strange paradox. Most of us absolutely dread the deadening or paralysis of our physical bodies, and we will do almost anything in our power to avoid it. But when it comes to the deadening and paralysis of our own soul, however, we do not seem to care one single iota. Even when we do consider the state of the soul, we generally only view a man as pitiable if he is obviously deficient in his basic ability to think or to learn. For example, we naturally pity the mentally retarded, and we feel sympathy for students who struggle with severe learning difficulties. But strangely, if somebody's internal sense of shame and their fundamental respect for truth are completely dead, we do not pity them. In fact, society will sometimes even praise this kind of stubborn, shameless behavior and call it determination or strong will. Imagine having a conversation with someone like this. You might ask them, "Do you realize that you are awake right now?" And they might reply, "No, I do not realize that any more than I do when I am dreaming and just have the mere impression that I am awake. You press them further, and is this waking impression in absolutely no way different from the dreaming one? And they calmly answer, no, they are no different at all. How can anyone possibly go on reasoning with such a person? What kind of fire or hot iron can be applied to his mind to shock him into being conscious of his true condition? The worst part is, he actually does sense the truth, but he deliberately pretends that he does not. And that deliberate deception makes his soul even worse off than a literal corpse. If one person simply does not notice a logical contradiction in his own reasoning, we can say he is just unfortunate. But if another person clearly notices the contradiction, understands it perfectly well, but still refuses to budge and will not back down from his false position, he is much more unfortunate. In his case, his basic sense of honor and truthfulness has been completely excised and removed. His capacity for reason has not been removed, but rather, it has been brutally corrupted and weaponized. Am I supposed to look at this kind of stubborn refusal to accept reality and call it strength of character? I absolutely cannot. I can no more call that strength than I can apply the word strength to the shameless audacity of degenerates, which enables them to go out in public and say and do whatever horrible things they please without any sense of shame. Now let us turn to chapter 6, which deals with the concept of divine providence. It is actually quite easy to praise providence for absolutely everything that happens in the natural world. However, this is only true provided that you possess two specific things. First, you must have the intellectual ability to see individual, isolated events within the much larger context of the whole universe. Second, you must have a genuine, internal sense of gratitude. If you are missing either of these two things, one of two negative outcomes will happen. Either you will completely fail to see the actual usefulness and purpose of what happens, or, even if you do somehow see its usefulness, you will simply refuse to be grateful for it. Consider the intelligent design of the world. If God had created all the beautiful colors in the world, but had never created the physical faculty of vision in our eyes, those colors would have been of very little use to anyone. Conversely, if God had created the incredible faculty of vision, but had not made sure that objects in the world could actually be seen and had color, that vision would have been completely worthless. And take it a step further. Even if God had made both of those things, eyes and colored objects, but had never created light to illuminate them, then neither the eyes nor the objects would have been of any value whatsoever. So we have to ask ourselves, who actually contrived this incredibly perfect, universal accommodation of things to one another? Who perfectly fitted the sword to the scabbard, and the scabbard to the sword? Are we really to believe that no one did? When we look at ordinary, human-made artifacts, it is exactly this kind of perfect symmetry and intentional structure that regularly and easily persuades us that they must be the deliberate work of some skilled artisan, instead of just being random objects that created themselves out of nothing. Does a carefully crafted sword and its matching scabbard testify loudly to their creator, whereas the infinitely more complex system of visible things, the eye's vision, and the sun's light, all working perfectly together, do not testify to theirs? What about the powerful desire of the male for sex with the female, and their mutual ability to use the complex physical organs that were specifically constructed for that exact purpose? Do these things not loudly proclaim their creator as well? All right then, if physical things are not enough, what about the incredibly complex organization of the human mind itself? The mind is built so that when we encounter sensible objects in the world, we do not just passively have their forms impressed upon us like a stamp on wax. Instead, we actively make a selection from among those impressions. We add them together, we subtract them from one another, and we form all sorts of complex mental combinations. And from those combinations, we take certain ideas and make logical inferences to other ideas that are somehow related. Are such astonishing cognitive abilities not able to make a big enough impression on us so that it becomes completely impossible for us to rationally discount the possibility of a creator? Because if you say there is no creator, then it is entirely left up to us to explain exactly who made these things. We would have to explain how such amazing, deeply craftsmanlike abilities just magically came into being completely by accident, entirely on their own. Now, are human beings completely alone in possessing such skills? It is absolutely true that there are many specific skills that are entirely distinctive to humans. These are skills that a human uniquely needs because he is a rational animal. However, the irrational animals do actually share many of the exact same basic physical faculties with man. But do those animals also understand what happens to them and around them? No, they do not. And this is because the simple use of a faculty is one thing, but the deep, rational understanding of that faculty is something entirely different. God certainly needed the animals, who just use impressions much like we do. However, he had a very special, elevated need for us humans, precisely because we are the only ones who actually understand the use of those impressions. And so, for the beasts of the field, it is perfectly enough for them to just eat, drink, sleep, breed, and do whatever else it is that naturally satisfies members of their specific species. But for us human beings who have been deliberately given this divine faculty of rational understanding, simply living like beasts is absolutely not enough. For human beings, unless we act appropriately, methodically, and strictly in line with our own unique rational nature and constitution, we will inevitably fall short of our proper purpose in life. Consider this. Creatures whose constitutions are completely different naturally have different ends and different functions accordingly. So, for those irrational creatures whose constitution is exclusively designed just for the use of things, that simple use on its own is entirely sufficient. However, where the higher capacity to actually understand that use is added, as it is in humans, the creature will only ever reach its true end by fully bringing that capacity for understanding into active play. God created some beasts specifically to be eaten by us. He created some to be used in farming and plowing fields. He created others to supply us with things like milk and cheese, and so on. In order to perfectly fulfill such basic functions, those animals simply do not need to intellectually comprehend their impressions, nor do they need to make complex rational distinctions among them. Man, however, was brought into this world for a completely different reason. Man was brought here to actively look upon God and to observe His magnificent works, and not just to passively look at them, but to truly appreciate and understand them. And so, it is absolutely inexcusable for a man to begin and end his life exactly where the beasts do. A human being should certainly begin where the beasts do, with basic physical needs, but he should only end his journey where nature left off dealing with him. Which is to say, a man's life should end in deep contemplation and profound understanding, and in a manner of life that is otherwise perfectly adapted to his high, rational nature. I beg you, please come to truly look upon and appreciate God's incredible works at least once before you die. Think about how eagerly you will travel all the way to the city of Olympia just to see the famous statue made by the sculptor Phidias. All of you would account it a terrible shame to die having never seen that specific man-made sight. But consider this. When there is absolutely no need to even travel anywhere, when you are already standing right there because God is present absolutely everywhere in His works, do you not want to simply look at those works and try to understand them? Will you truly never come to a full realization of who you actually are? Will you never realize what you have been born for, and the specific purpose for which the divine gift of vision was made in our case? You might complain and say, but difficult and highly disagreeable things happen in this life. To that, I would reply, well, are there not difficult and disagreeable things found when you travel to Olympia? Do you not get terribly hot in the sun? Do you not get crushed and crowded by the masses of people? Is finding a place to bathe not a huge problem there? Do you not get completely soaked through in your seats when it suddenly rains? Do you not finally get sick and tired of the endless noise, the loud shouting, and all the other petty irritations of being there? Of course you do, but I can only suppose that you mentally weigh all of those negatives against the immense worth of seeing the show, and in the end, you choose to be patient and you simply put up with it all. Furthermore, unlike when you go to a show, in life you have been given profound inner strengths that enable you to bear up with difficulties of every possible kind. You have been explicitly given the virtues of fortitude, courage, and patience. So why in the world should I worry about what happens to me if I am fully armed with the virtue of fortitude? If I have fortitude, absolutely nothing can truly trouble or upset me. Nothing can even seem annoying. Instead of meeting my misfortune with pathetic groans and tears, I will simply call upon the exact faculty that was especially provided to me by nature to deal with it. You might whine and say, but my nose is running. To which I would say, what do you have hands for, you idiot, if not to wipe your own nose? But then you might argue back, but how is it even right that there should be such things as running noses in the world in the first place? I would simply ask you, instead of wasting your time thinking up philosophical protests about reality, would it not be much easier to just use your hands and wipe your nose? Think about the great hero Hercules. What do you think would have actually become of Hercules if there had been no terrible lion for him to fight? What if there had been no many-headed hydra, no giant stag, or no monstrous boar? What if there had been no savage, violent criminals for him to rid the world of? What in the world would Hercules have done in the complete absence of such massive challenges? The answer is obvious. He would have just rolled over in his warm bed and gone right back to sleep. And so, by comfortably snoring his entire life away in luxury and perfect comfort, he never would have developed into the mighty, legendary Hercules that we know. And even if he had somehow developed those muscles in his sleep, what good would it have actually done him? What would have been the use of those incredibly strong arms, that magnificent physique, and that noble, courageous soul, if there had been no crises or dangerous conditions to actually stir him into action? Hearing this, you might say, well, in that case, perhaps Hercules should have just created those monsters himself, by actively searching around for a lion to bring into his own land, and finding his own boar and hydra to fight. To that, I say no. That would have been the completely irrational act of a fool and a fanatic. You do not need to go looking for trouble. But still, by simply showing up in the world and being discovered by him, those terrible monsters proved incredibly useful as the ultimate tests of Hercules' manhood and strength. Now that you fully understand all of this, I want you to step forward and truly appreciate the incredible internal resources you already have. And once you have done that, you should be able to confidently say, "Bring on absolutely whatever difficulties you like, Zeus. I am ready because I have the resources and I have a constitution that you specifically gave to me. By means of those gifts, I can do myself credit and handle whatever happens." But no, that is not what most of you do. Instead, there you sit, constantly worrying that certain negative events might happen in the future. You are already upset and in a terrible state of anxiety about your present circumstances. And because of this anxiety, you turn around and reproach the gods. What else can possibly come of such weakness and complaining except absolute impiety? And yet, consider what God has actually done for us. God has not merely given us the internal strength to tolerate our troubles without being humiliated or completely undone. He went further than that. As befitted a true king and a loving father, he has given those strengths to us completely free from any constraint, compulsion, or impediment. He has put the whole matter entirely in our own control. He did not even reserve to himself any power to hinder us or stand in our way when it comes to our own will. But even though you possess these incredible powers, and even though they are completely free and entirely your own, you simply do not use them. Why? Because you still do not realize what you actually have, nor do you realize where it came from. Instead of using your power, you sit around crying and complaining. Some of you are completely blind to your great benefactor, and you are entirely unable to even acknowledge his existence. Others among you actually do acknowledge God, but you assail him with endless complaints and bitter accusations, acting out of sheer meanness of spirit. I am fully prepared to show you that you do, in fact, have the resources and a character that is naturally strong and resilient. So, show me in return what logical grounds you could possibly have for being so peevish and malcontent. Now let us move to Chapter 7, which discusses the utility of changing arguments, hypothetical arguments, and the rest of logical training. Most people out in the world simply do not realize that rigorous practice in changing arguments, working through hypothetical arguments, dealing with arguments that conclude with a question, and so forth, actually has a direct bearing on our morals and our character. You see, in philosophy, we are deeply interested in how the genuinely good man will act, and how he will acquit himself in absolutely any situation he might face. So suppose someone were to say that the virtuous man will simply spurn the practice of question and answer entirely, or that, if he does engage in it, he will be totally indifferent as to whether he behaves carelessly or at random. We know that cannot be right. A good man is not careless, and if we accept neither of those alternatives, then we are forced to concede that some serious study simply must be made of the very areas with which questioning and answering are especially concerned. Let us ask, what does human reason actually purport to do? Its job is to establish what is objectively true, to completely eliminate what is demonstrably false, and to carefully suspend judgment in cases that remain doubtful. Is knowing that definition all one has to learn? Someone might say yes. But think about it this way. Well, is it enough, if you simply do not want to be conned in the daily use of money, just to be told a basic rule like, always accept real coins and always reject counterfeit ones? No, of course it is not enough. What else is practically necessary? Obviously, you have to actually learn the specific art of testing the coins and distinguishing the genuinely valuable coins from the clever fake ones. And so it is exactly the same in the case of our reason. In addition to just knowing what reason is supposed to do, we also have to actually learn how to test and distinguish what is genuinely true, what is truly false, and what is merely unclear. That is an absolute necessity. Furthermore, what else does reason logically prescribe? It prescribes that we must accept the natural consequence of whatever has already been admitted to be correct. And is knowing that rule all you need to know? No, you also need to learn the specific logical rules of consequence. You need to understand how a conclusion sometimes follows from just one single premise, and how sometimes it follows from several different premises working in combination. Then surely this logical skill too must be actively acquired by the man who is intent on acquitting himself intelligently in all logical matters. He needs this skill both when he is offering his own proofs and demonstrations to others, and when he is carefully following the complex demonstrations of others. He needs this so that he is not foolishly conned or fooled when people produce tricky sophisms and present them as if the proofs were really sound and true. And so, because of all this, there has developed among us philosophers a rigorous system of study and training in conclusive arguments and logical figures. Both of these things have proven to be absolutely indispensable for a good life. Now, consider a difficult logical situation. There are certain cases where we have rightly and correctly granted the initial premises of an argument, and yet, those very premises seem to yield a conclusion which, although it is clearly false, nevertheless logically follows from the premises we granted. What in the world am I to do then? Should I just blindly accept the clearly false conclusion? How can I possibly do that as a rational person? Should I turn around and say that I erred in granting the initial premises? But in this scenario, that has been ruled out too, because we know the premises were right. Should I just stubbornly claim that the conclusion did not actually follow from the premises? But if it structurally did, this is not an honest option either. So, what exactly should I do in such frustrating cases? Well, think about it in terms of a financial loan. Just as it is not enough to simply have borrowed money in the past to establish that you are actually still in debt today. To still be in debt, you must still stand by the original loan, which means you must not have repaid it already. In the exact same way, in this logical case, it is not enough just to have granted the premises at the beginning of an argument to establish that we must automatically admit the final conclusion. We must still actually be committed to those exact same premises at the end of the argument. Now, if the premises remain exactly what they were when we first granted them, then we are under every logical obligation to stand by what was granted, and we absolutely must accept whatever conclusion follows from them. But if the premises do not remain as they were, if they have subtly shifted or changed their meaning during the debate, then we absolutely do not have to accept the conclusion. The conclusion no longer holds any weight for us, nor is it fitting that we should accept it, since we have essentially retracted our admission of those original premises because they changed. That is exactly why we need to rigorously study premises of this very kind. We need to pay special attention to premises that involve subtle changes and alterations. These are premises such that, in the very process of questioning, answering, drawing conclusions, and so forth, they undergo sneaky changes. These changes cause the untutored and untrained mind to become completely confused when finally confronted with the false conclusions. Why must we study this? So that we can completely avoid acting in these matters in a confused, awkward, or inappropriate way. It is no different when dealing with hypotheses and hypothetical arguments. It is sometimes absolutely necessary to posit a hypothesis as a starting basis for a succeeding argument. But then we have to ask, should we just grant every single hypothesis that is proposed to us, or not? And if we should not grant every one, then which specific ones should we grant? Furthermore, once we have actually admitted a hypothesis, should we stubbornly abide by that admission come what may, or should we sometimes step back and repudiate it? Should we logically accept whatever is consistent with the hypothesis and firmly reject whatever is in conflict with it? The answer is obviously yes. But then a clever opponent comes along and says, I will make you accept the hypothesis of something that is entirely possible. And then, using only logic, I will lead you on to a conclusion that is entirely impossible. When faced with this kind of trick, what will the truly wise man do? Will he refuse to engage with such a tricky person and just avoid all dialogue and intellectual examination? No, he cannot do that. Because of all the people in the world, the wise man is supposed to be the most adept in argument, the greatest expert in question and answer, and completely proof against all sophisms and logical deceit. Or will the wise man engage with the tricky person, but do so without caring whether he himself argues in a confused or careless manner? But in that case, how then will he still be the sort of wise and perfect man we imagine him to be? He would just be a careless fool. The truth is, in default of proper logical training and strict preparation, how can any person accurately follow the complex progress of an argument? If someone can somehow show us that he can easily do this without any training, then all of our intense logical exercises were just a complete waste of time. They were utterly odious and useless all along, and they were not actually entailed by our preconception of what makes a philosopher. But we know training is necessary. So why are we still so lazy, indifferent, and dull? Why do we constantly look for lazy excuses to avoid the hard work of training and exercising our powers of reason? You might try to excuse your laziness by saying, look, if I make an error in such abstract logical matters, it is not a big deal. I haven't killed my own father, have I? To that I say, no, you fool, for there was no father standing there in the logical argument for you to kill. What did you do instead? You made the one and only mistake you actually had the opportunity to make in that specific situation. You made a logical error. You know, I once tried to use that exact same excuse myself. I said the same thing to my teacher, Musonius, when he strongly reproached me for not discovering a glaring omission in a certain logical syllogism. I defensively said to him, come on, it is not like I burned down the Capitol building in Rome. And Musonius looked at me and said, you idiot, the omission in this logical argument is your Capitol building. You just burned it down. I mean, really think about this. Are killing your own father and burning down the Capitol building the only actual crimes in the world? What about using one's own mental impressions recklessly, carelessly, and completely at random? What about failing to logically analyze an argument to see if it is a valid proof or a dangerous fallacy? And in a word, what about failing to see, in the very act of question and answer, exactly what agrees with your own philosophical position and what conflicts with it? Is there absolutely nothing wrong in all of that intellectual laziness? This brings us to Chapter 8, which discusses the important fact that raw talents can actually be treacherous for the uneducated person. In the realm of rhetoric and logic, it is entirely possible to vary the specific forms of rhetorical proofs and enthymemes, in just as many complex ways as it is possible to vary logical terms that are basically equivalent to each other. Take, for example, the following simple logical argument. If you borrowed money from me in the past and you did not repay it, then logically, you still owe me the money. This formulation is logically equivalent to saying, it is not the case that you borrowed the money and did not repay it, and also do not owe me the money. Now, no one in the world is better equipped to argue these points skillfully than the true philosopher. Because if you understand that an enthymeme is just an incomplete syllogism, then naturally, someone who has been rigorously trained in handling the complete syllogism will, a fortiori, be no less proficient at handling the simpler incomplete syllogism. But you might ask, so if that is true, why aren't we constantly training ourselves and each other in exactly this sort of clever, rhetorical argumentation? The answer is simple. Because right now, at this very moment, even though we aren't being intensely trained in these complex logical topics, and even though we aren't being distracted at all from the primary business of improving our actual character, at least so far as I have any say in the matter, we still aren't making enough real progress toward the ultimate goal of virtue. So what in the world can we expect to happen if we suddenly take on this massive additional project of studying complex rhetoric? Especially since it won't just simply distract us from the much weightier matters of our moral character, but it will also inevitably become no small cause of pride and terrible egotism among the students. The abilities to offer clever proof and persuasive speech are indeed great talents, especially when they are properly trained, and especially when they are complemented by a certain amount of natural verbal elegance. However, in general, absolutely every great talent, when it falls into the hands of someone who is morally weak, comes with the massive risk of making them completely conceited and totally full of themselves. I mean, if we focus entirely on clever speech, what is to stop a very promising young student from simply becoming a slave to these rhetorical topics, rather than becoming a true master of them? Won't that young student just brush all of these moral cautions aside? Won't he just constantly parade his fancy learning in front of us? He will become proud, completely elated with himself, and totally deaf to anyone who would try to forcefully remind him of the deeper moral studies he has given up, and the critical areas of his character where he still falls short. But someone might object and say, but wasn't Plato a great philosopher? Yes, Plato was a philosopher, and Hippocrates was a great physician. Then they might argue, and just look at how incredibly well Hippocrates expresses himself in his writing. Yes, he writes beautifully, but is it specifically in his capacity as a physician that Hippocrates expresses himself so well? No. Please do not confuse different qualities that just happen to be found in the exact same writer only incidentally. Think about it this way. If the philosopher Plato had happened to be incredibly physically strong and exceptionally handsome, should I then also try to become strong and handsome? Should I act as if physical beauty were somehow essential to the study of philosophy, just because there happened to be one particular philosopher who combined his philosophy with good looks? Can you really not tell the fundamental difference between the specific things that actually make people true philosophers and the other random qualities that are only found in those people completely by chance? I mean, look at me. If I am a philosopher and I happen to be lame, would you feel that you were logically required to go and become lame as well in order to be a philosopher? Of course not. So by saying all of this, Am I completely slighting these rhetorical talents? Am I saying they are worthless? Not at all. I would not slight them any more than I would disparage the incredible physical gift of sight. But if you ask me what the one, single, real good is in the case of a human being, I can only give you one answer. It is the right kind of moral character. That is the only true good. Now let us move to Chapter 9, which asks a profound question. What are the practical consequences for us of being truly related to God? If what the great philosophers say about the intimate kinship of God and man is actually true, then there is only one logical step for us to take. We must do exactly as Socrates did. When someone asked Socrates where he was from, he never replied with the small-minded answer, "I am an Athenian," or "I am from Corinth." Instead, his answer was always, "I am a citizen of the world." After all, why would you just say, "I am an Athenian"? Why would you choose to only identify yourself with the one tiny, exact spot of earth where your sorry, mortal body happened to be dropped at birth? Clearly, when you say you are an Athenian, you prefer that somewhat higher designation because it not only includes that one insignificant spot of birth, but it also includes your parents, your family history, and all your ancestors who lived there before you. It is entirely on these broader grounds that you characterize yourself as an Athenian or a Corinthian. But consider the perspective of anyone who truly knows how the whole universe is actually administered. That person knows that the first, the greatest, and the most all-inclusive state is the grand government composed of God and man together. He deeply appreciates this divine government as the ultimate source of the very seeds of being. He knows those seeds descended from God upon his own father, upon his father's father, and in fact, upon every single creature born and bred on this earth. But he knows those seeds descended upon rational beings in a very particular, special way. This is because rational beings, like humans, are the only ones who are entitled by their very nature to actually govern alongside God. We are entitled to do this by virtue of being directly connected with Him through our shared faculty of reason. So, if we understand all of this, why should we not proudly call ourselves true citizens of the world and literal children of God? And if we are the children of God, why in the world should we ever fear any petty human contingency or earthly misfortune? Think about it in these practical terms. If merely being related to the human emperor or being connected to any of the other great, powerful politicians in the city of Rome is considered more than enough to allow a person to live completely without fear, enjoying immense privilege and absolute security, shouldn't our relationship with the divine mean infinitely more? If we truly have God Himself as our personal creator, our loving Father, and our ultimate defender, shouldn't that profound connection protect us far more from any kind of earthly trouble or anxiety? Yet invariably, someone will still worry and complain, saying, "But practically speaking, how am I supposed to find food to eat if I find myself completely destitute and without money?" To answer that, I ask you to think about people who are in far worse positions than you. Well, what about common slaves? What about runaways who have absolutely nothing to their name? What in the world do they depend on for their basic survival when they make the desperate choice to flee from their powerful masters? Do they depend on their own private lands? No, they don't have any. Do they depend on their servants? No, they have none. Do they depend on their silverware or expensive possessions? No. And yet, despite having absolutely none of those things, they still manage to survive. They still find ways to eat and live. So if a simple runaway slave can somehow manage to survive in this world, why should a rational human being, who claims to understand his true relationship with God, be completely paralyzed by the fear of poverty?